The next paper is a joint paper by Daniel Wallace and Sean McGuire. Daniel Wallace is Executive Director of the CSNTM, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. And Sean McGuire is about to complete his MA at the Dallas Theological Seminary. Their paper is entitled Disturbing Dittographies, a second take on scribal corrections.
Well, good afternoon to you all. We will not be using anything on the screen. You all should have a copy of our paper. We will not be able to read this paper in its entirety, so try to keep up as we skip both small and large sections throughout. My interest in dittographies was piqued nearly 40 years ago when I first taught a course on New Testament textual criticism. An early assignment was a collation of Sinaiticus against the majority text in 1 Thessalonians 2. When the students came to verse 14, they did not know what to do. The scribe had made a backward leap 11 lines to tu theou in verse 13 and proceeded to copy 26 words before realizing his mistake, up to tu theou in verse 14. In the process, he made 2 orthographic changes and even created a nonsense reading. This blunder raises a host of questions. Were all of scribes always so careless? If they could not even copy the dittographies correctly, what might this tell us about their general accuracy, especially when dealing with homoiouteleuta? Thus began our inquiry into an overlooked aspect of internal evidence. We started with Sinaiticus, but soon found that many dittographies in other manuscripts suffered from unwarranted neglect. Introductory works on New Testament textual criticism are generally agreed. A dittography is, in the words of Milligan, the wrong repetition of word or syllable. Taylor calls it the mistake of writing a word or phrase twice when it should be copied once. Metzger and Ehrman elaborate. Sometimes the eye of the scribe picked up the same word or group of words a second time, and as a result, copied twice which should have appeared only once. The essential definition, treating dittographies as an accidental repetition, is found in the standard textbooks almost ubiquitously. But the nomenclature has some curious inconsistencies. Milligan offers 2 variants in wording. The one in his glossary quoted above, wrong repetition of word or syllable, but when he first mentions dittography, he speaks only of the same word written twice. Neither Taylor nor Metzger and Ehrman include syllable in their definition. Kearsarge Lake says a dittography is where a word or phrase is senselessly repeated twice. By adding twice to repeated, he is unwittingly defining a trittography. In spite of these differences, one constant is seen in the various definitions. Dittography is a scribal error, an accidental repeating of what was initially written. And because of this assumption, dittographies are routinely dismissed, deserving no other consideration than as textbook illustrations of scribal gaffes. There is some pushback against dividing textual alterations into intentional and unintentional. In Caldwell's pioneering foray into scribal habits, he claims to base a primary classification of readings upon the presence or absence of intention is to anticipate the establishment of probabilities which must be established in other ways. Parker adds, only the production of complete nonsense can safely be called accidental. Consequently, what may appear to be an unintentional repetition might be a conscious scribal addition to the text. By attaching inattentiveness to the definition, critics might be prejudging a text that needs a closer look. In light of these issues, we define dittography as the repetition of what was initially written, encompassing anything from a single letter to several lines, and perhaps even a whole book. The repeated wording may be the same as or similar to the initial wording. This expands on previous definitions in two key ways. The dittography is not necessarily identical to the initial wording, and the nature of the reading is not restricted to unintentional mistakes. The reason for the repetition needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Dittographies and haplographies are often played off against each other as explanations of the variants. The problem in 1 John 2:23 is a case in point. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Everyone who confesses the Son has the Father. Most manuscripts lack the second clause, often cited as a textbook example of haplography, occasioned by the double ton pater echai. For some critics, however, the longer reading is a dittography. But if it is a dittography, as it stands, it is hardly accidental, since an accident could not explain the addition of homologon. In Acts 4:17, did Luke describe the Sanhedrin's decision to threaten Peter and John not to speak in Jesus' name with just apele somatha? Or did he emphasize the threat with the cognate dative, apele somatha? An error involving a single letter is found in 1 Thessalonians 2:7. Paul either said, "We became little children among you," or "We became gentle among you." Did the apostle write, or rather dictate, egenethemen napioi or egenethemen apioi? Is this haplography or dittography? Most dittographies, however, are palpable mistakes with no possibility of a haplographic alternative. Washingtonianus has an uncorrected 24-word dittograph occupying five complete lines beginning with Haima in John 6:56. This was occasioned by the same 10-word sequence that begins both 54 and verse 56. The copyist looked back to verse 54 and proceeded to duplicate the text up to the Haima of verse 56. GA1 has a duplication in Romans 6:20 that makes acceptable grammatical sense but horrible theological sense. Hatakar douloi eta tes hamartias, elutheroi eta tes hamartias. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free from sin. The relatively few dittographs in Vaticanus throughout the Pandect are evident in several places where a later scribe did not retrace the original letters. What makes B's corrections unusual is that the first-hand errors are corrected by the later hand doing nothing. Even when dittographies are clearly unintentional, they may contain noteworthy information. A case in point is a dittograph in P45. Acts 15, verses 2 through 8 is found on folio 28 verso. All that is left on the first line is the last word and a half of verse 2. Verse 7 begins midway on line 11. As the copyist wrote zetesaos, he glanced back to the same word in verse 2 and proceeded to copy a 23-word dittograph from that verse. ECM records the dittograph, but in a rather cryptic manner. The apparatus at verse 7 has omit, P45F. The F stands for failure, mistake, though without indicating what kind of mistake it is. One has to consult the supplementary volume at 15.7 to see the dittography. Yet even here, nothing is mentioned about this being a duplication from verse 2. Although INTF is to be applauded for its long history of packing maximum information into minimum space, the significance of this dittography warrants clarity over efficiency. More than 90 Pauline manuscripts locate Hebrews immediately after 2 Thessalonians. As far as we know, Gregory Allen's 794 is the only manuscript that has 1st and 2nd Hebrews. The first after 2 Thessalonians and the second after Philemon. There was a change in scribes at 1 Timothy 5:4, beginning with the new folio. The second scribe penned 1 Timothy 5:4 to the end, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and then Hebrews. What's the reason for the second Hebrews? Is it possible that the scribe considered the first Hebrews to be inadequate textually? That's hardly likely. Although there are scores of difference between the two copies of Hebrews, the scribes differ from one another in only 16 meaningful variants, which taken together point to two different exemplars. The greater probability is that the second scribe was unaware that Hebrews had already been penned. So, in one sense, the second Hebrews is a massive dittography. It is a text written twice that should have been written once. This dittography, paradoxically both intentional and unintentional, and written by a later scribe, deserves its place among the late medieval witnesses to the New Testament text. And now Sean is going to discuss dittographies in diglots.
Dittographies in diglot manuscripts may offer insights into the relationship between the two languages. In GA 629, the Latin and Greek text occur in parallel columns on each page, with the Latin on the left and the Greek on the right. Wasserman states, 629 is an unusual manuscript, one in which the text of the Latin column has heavily influenced the Greek column. This Codex's Dittographies adds further evidence to the Latin's priority over the Greek. 5 long dittographies occur in the Latin column that are absent in the Greek. In Romans 7:2, a dittography occurs in the Latin column, while the Greek column has a distinct 3-line gap. The cause of the dittography is "vivente viro" in 7:2, which parallels "vivente viro" in 7:3. The scribe recopies the latter half of verse 2, and then the first three words of verse 3. The corrector did not mark the dittography where it technically begins or ends. Instead, the first 3 words of 7:3 are incorrectly marked for deletion, while the last 3 words of the dittography are not. Such mislabeling is a common phenomenon in 629. Some scenarios are more straightforward to delineate, while in others, deciding where the dittography begins could result in 2 different readings. For example, in Hebrews 3:9, the scribe marked the dittography again, perhaps with imprecision. Here there is a question as to the exemplar's wording. The issue can be seen by comparing the Vulgate with 629, with the marked dittography underlined, as you can see. The corrector marked the dittography as "probuerunt me patres vestri," lines 26 through 27. Line 26 is blank in the Greek column. The second "probuerunt" on line 27 is not deleted. The repeated "patres vestri probuerunt" is clearly part of the dittograph. But the second "me" is ambiguous, as evidenced by the manuscript tradition. Depending on which reading the exemplar attests, the dittography could be "me patres vestri probuerunt" or "patres vestri probuerunt." In short, the more complex the textual tradition is, the more uncertain the decision on where the dittography begins and ends becomes. The 2 examples discussed above show that the Latin column was likely produced first and then corrected before the Greek column was penned. And now Dan will continue.
Intentional dittographies. In Revelation 18:2, an angel announces Babylon's demise and repeats epicene, while Codex P025 adds yet another epicene, a trittography. The copyist almost surely wanted to underscore the fate of Babylon's damnation. Perhaps the scribe wrote the trebled epicene as a mirrored contrast to the trisagion in 4:8. The heavenly choir sings Hagios, Hagios, Hagios in praise of the Almighty in Revelation 4:8. And this becomes a triple trisagion in the Andreas manuscripts. Should we call this accidental? Hardly. Yet Olive's scribe A seems to have committed a haplographic error within the trittography, because O1 has Hagios just 8 times. In Romans 8, the apostle takes pains to emphasize key points. In verse 7, he brings out double implications of God's paternal claims on believers. Now, if children, then heirs. On the one hand, heirs of God. On the other hand, fellow heirs with Christ. Lectionary 895 takes this one step further by emphasizing our status as God's offspring. Now, if children and heirs. This seems to be an intentional dittography done in the spirit of 830, where Paul doubles verbs and pronouns in his Ordo Salutis. In Acts 19:28, the rabble cries out, "Megale he Artemis Ephesion." This is introduced with the imperfect ekrazon, suggesting an iterative force. 6 verses later, verse 34, the crowd is screaming once again, but with the added temporal note for about 2 hours. Vaticanus alone doubles the exclamation, perhaps to emphasize this lengthy tirade. Furthermore, the text was re-inked by the later scribe, unlike the treatment of accidental dittographs. And this provides an excellent illustration of the problematic view of treating all dittographies as mistakes. This may be accidental or it may be intentional. In our view, it is a dittography regardless of the underlying reason. John 8:12 twice. Perhaps the most significant illustrations of intentionality can be found in the repetition of John 8:12. This verse was written out twice, in whole or in part, in 15 continuous text manuscripts. The first occurrence comes immediately after 752, that is, it skips the pericope adulteri. This is followed by the pericope with 8:12, then duplicated. 7 of these manuscripts repeat the verse in toto. 8 manuscripts have only 8:12a, Paulin to Cosmo, before the PA, but the whole verse afterward. Robinson suggests that such duplications of 8:12 are not accidental dittographies, but intentional for lection-related purposes. He also notes that the same manuscripts, which generally contain a Byzantine consensus text throughout the Gospels, nevertheless divide significantly within the text of the PA. This can also be said of John 8:12. Among all 1,600 continuous text manuscripts, the 5-word sequence, autois elalesen ha Iesus legon, is one of at least 13 variations. The major variants involve transpositions, but importantly, all varieties are coherent and textually significant. If John 8:12 had been intentionally written both before and after the PA, would we not expect the two texts to be identical? Of the 7 codices with a fully duplicated verse, 3 of them, 115, 286, and 552, have significant differences for the doubled verse. And I discussed these 3, but skip down to the last one, Gregory Allen 552. GA 552 has the most extensive changes. Taking them as a unit, we have autois ha Iesus elalese legon in the text of 552. This is before the pericope adulteri. And then the dittography is ha Iesus exilthon proston achlan ipen. This dittograph clearly involves significant changes that would be quite impossible to explain as accidental. Robinson suggests that after 811, a transition statement is added to the text of 552 before the scribe wrote the second part of verse 12. He considers the second mention to be incomplete. This is not correct. The verse begins with Paulin un ha Iesus. The dittography rewrites a portion of the verse that follows this introduction, but it is not missing anything. To sum up on John 8:12, although it has been claimed that the repetition of this verse is intentional on each occasion, the evidence does not bear this out. First of all, less than 1% of all gospel manuscripts with the pericope adulteri have John 8:12 before the PA. If the first writing of this verse were a marker for the reader to skip the PA, why are there not more manuscripts, in fact, a lot more, that display this pattern? Why do almost all the manuscripts with the pericope have 8:12 only after the PA? Can 15 examples out of 1,600 definitively speak of a supposed pattern related to lectionaries? And second, 43% of the manuscripts with 8:12 doubled in toto show meaningful variations between the two sentences. It can hardly be assumed that the second writing is simply careless. And third, the evidence points to a situation in which a scribe absent-mindedly wrote John 8:12 immediately after John 7:52. And then realizing that the exemplar did not have the PA, the scribe then continued using the second exemplar. Realizing that the exemplar did not have the PA, the copyist replaced that exemplar with a different one that had the pericope. The scribe then continued using the second exemplar after the pericope. Thus, in this scenario, the first writing of 812 was really unintentional, while the dittograph was intentional. And at least for 115, 286, and 552, it is likely that these manuscripts indirectly witness to an exemplar that lacked the pericope adulteri. And now Sean will speak about Sinaiticus.
Dittographies in Codex Sinaiticus. Please skip down to the long dittographies. There are 31 long dittographes identified in Sinaiticus. Of those, 13 are exact copies of the initial text with no deviation. 9 are textually different from the initial text but are insignificant. This leaves 9 long dittographes that involve textually different and significant variants from their initial text. We will address one example to serve as an illustration. In Lamentations 1:6, Scribe B1 created a 5-line, 9-word dittography of Lamentations 1:11b. What makes this dittography unusual is that the scribe apparently looked forward 5 verses, but instead of producing a haplography, he created a dittography by adding the text from 1:11 to 1:6. Thus, paradoxically, the addition at Lamentations 1:6 is an example of a dittograph that occurs before the initial text. The dittograph contains 3 textually different readings from the Codex's wording. Lamentations 1:11b reads, "They gave her, autes, desired objects for food, eis brosin, to return, epistrepse, the life," while the dittography reads, "They gave their, auton, desired objects for food, en brose, to give rest to, anapause, the life." In the dittography, in Lamentations 1:6, B1 leaps forward from nomen, verse 6, to eduken in verse 11. In Lamentations 1:11b, different manuscripts and versions attest all 3 variant readings. Including Lamentations 1:6, there are 5 significant long dittographes. Including Lamentations 1:6, there are 5 significant long dittographies containing variant readings that are attested by other manuscripts. This multifaceted textual tradition hints at the necessity for further probing. And now Dan will come up and conclude.
We have argued that dittography should not a priori be treated as mental lapses. And even when they are, due to inattentiveness, they may provide valuable information on the text and transmission of the New Testament. The dittograph of a fragmentary papyrus leaf may be our only access to what had presumably been written earlier. A duplication done by a later copyist could give us clues about the creation of a manuscript, even revealing the text of a previously unrecorded witness. Dittographs in one language of a diglot can illuminate the sources and direction of influences. Paradoxically, dittographies in some manuscripts might be fully intentional, while the initial writing would have been written absent-mindedly. And some dittographies with variants, especially those that are attested in other witnesses, should be given priority over the initial writing as better representatives of the exemplar. Then there are the more than 300 dittographies in Aleph that supply more information about the scribal habits involved in its making. The inexact copying of most of the larger dittographs reveals the depths of the scribal blunders beyond what we already knew. This puts in bold relief that many of Oleph's readings may be occasioned by homoioteliuton, both dittographies and haplographies. Dittographies are, of course, easier to spot, but when a shorter reading in this codex could be due to homoioteliuton, regard for its testimony should be reduced, for example, in Revelation 4:8 and Mark 1:1. Finally, a recommendation. In light of our findings, we propose that future apparatuses, both of hand editions of the New Testament and more comprehensive works, add a category for these readings, namely, superscript the manuscript identification with DITT. Two T's are important because it's a dittography. In hand editions, the dittographs do not normally need to be listed except when the wording differs from the original reading. But for the ECM, every dit should be recorded, for they give a more comprehensive view of a scribal habit. Dittographies are only one piece of the puzzle, but they make a small contribution toward answering the call of Hort's dictum that knowledge of documents should precede final judgment upon readings. Since they've hardly been explored, dittographies are an open field for further investigation. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Remarks?
I believe the ECM has a convention for when a manuscript presents the same verse or text twice. It has a -1 and a -2. Do you think that would be adequate, or do you prefer a more explicit identification of dittography as opposed to other kinds of repetition?
I would prefer it to be more explicit. I tell my students when they get their Nestle text, I say, look, you guys are confused by all the letters and numbers and sigla. This thing would be 10 times the size if it had it all explained, and it would cost about 100 times more than you're paying. So shut up and be happy with it. But in certain places, they need to be a little bit more explicit, and I think this is one of them, especially because dittographies have really just not been studied.
We have time for another question. Comments? Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.